All right, we're good. Well, hey, thanks to everybody for coming. My name's PeteMastin. I work for a company called Sodexis. We've been blessed enough to be mentioned a number of times today, so I'm really glad we organized this particular talk the way we did, which is rather than me come up and tell you about what Sodexis does or how we do it, we thought we would bring some of our great clients up and let them talk about their use cases, because they're very different, right? It's not always just simply multi-CDN or multi-cloud or whatever. And so we thought we would do that. And so the fellows I have on stage with me here are Mike Norton from PBS, Jared Shapiro from Roblox, a top gaming company, and Zach Schenker from Mubi, which is actually the quote came from, the quote the last speaker talked about was actually from Zach. So we're super excited about talking about it. I'm going to tell you just really briefly, if you hadn't actually heard who we are. Sodexis was founded in 2009 by two ex-Akamai guys, one in Paris, one in North America, in Portland, Oregon. And they had this idea of using crowdsourced data to route traffic to the best performing CDN or cloud. So, you know, fast forward to 2016, we literally get billions of measurements of the internet every day, and we use that to route traffic on behalf of our clients. As you can see, we have a bunch of great customers that already use the service. Wanted to run through kind of how we see the CDN market evolving, and it very much corresponds very exactly to what you've already heard today, which is most people start out with a single CDN, and they have some disadvantages from that kind of model. And then they move to multi-CDN, and then perhaps they even move to a hybrid model to cut costs. And finally, some customers, for a variety of reasons, might move all the way to an actual complete private CDN, and that's what you'll hear some of this today. So we've got examples of a single, a dual CDN configuration. We've got an example of multiple CDNs configured for both cost and performance, and we've got an example on stage here of someone who actually has built a complete private CDN using Sodexis. So can't wait to get to that. One more thing, Mr. Tim Siglin did a study this last year on 800 media companies, media entertainment companies, and what he found were that between the internal private CDNs and multi-CDN, over 60% of people had already implemented. So it's very much the case that multi-CDN and private CDN is as my kids would say, it's a thing. It's actually a thing. It's something that people are doing. It's not just for the early adopters anymore. In fact, a lot of the enterprises that we talk to that are just coming around to it feel like they're behind the ball. So, and of course, that's a very exciting thing for Sodexis. And there's all the data about that study, and that was done by Tim. So one more thing, we're going to talk a little bit about ROI in this and what we mean by ROI. And quite frankly, ROI isn't just about the cash, right? It could be about a lot of things. It could be about reduction in cost, but it could be increase in revenue. It could be about, you'll hear from Mike, his biggest concern was customer support. He was getting complaints, right? So he wanted to be able to quell that. So ROI is a broad term. We use it broadly, not narrowly to be just, your cash dollars. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to have Jared, Mike, and Zach quickly describe their implementations. I'm going to ask a few questions, and what we really want here is you guys to ask questions, right? So I want this to be interactive. So we're going to try to go through this very quickly, so there's plenty of time for that. If there's not, obviously, you can approach us afterwards. So with that, Jared, if you could give us a walkthrough of Roblox and sort of what you guys implemented and why.
Sure. So super quick overview of what Roblox is. We are a platform for people to make user-generated games or imagination experiences. Games is a convenient shorthand, but we see all kinds of content being created, whether it's interactive art spaces, things with actual game mechanic, realistic simulations, reenactments of world events, all kinds of stuff. Our core demographic are users between about 8 and 18. Last year, 5 million games were created, about 100 million hours were spent in-game last month, about 360,000 peak concurrent users last month, and about 9 petabytes of content delivered last month. Go to the next slide, please.
Got it.
So we approached Sodexis a while back. We're looking to reevaluate our current agreements with our CDN provider as our term was coming up. We were looking for a good way to measure performance across a number of competitors. And we came across just the rich functionality that Sodexis had there. And we put in place a bunch of test probes on a bunch of providers and started to measure performance for our particular users. You can go to the next slide. Got my data science team involved, make sure what we were looking at was statistically significant, and just make sure that we were going about this in a sane way and could make actionable decisions based on this. You can go on. Once we had that in place, it really made sense to start federating our content to different providers, just based on different performance characteristics we saw around the world, and even within the same region. We saw some providers are doing much better consistently, some providers in really micro areas were outperforming other providers. So rather than having a single provider to cover us worldwide, especially with a bunch of international growth we've been seeing, and even federating just by geolocation, it really made sense to have multiple providers in the mix across the board, and Sodexis provided the mechanism for us to do that. So what we looked at were what dimensions we want to optimize by, and we came across these curves to plug in the various dimensions to come up with a composite score for any given provider, and that's what we're looking at here. You can go to the next slide. Once we had that in place, we started to model the data to make sure what we were looking at made sense. And so these are a couple different slices of some of these dimensions. So if you look at the one on the top left, for example, performance is plotted along the x-axis, plugged into the curve, and availability on the y-axis. And you see that there's a really steep drop-off after about like 95%, where we just stop looking or honoring a given provider, throwing them in the mix if their performance in terms of availability drops off. Whereas performance, as you see it sort of go back along the y-axis from the bottom right, you see it's a little bit more of an S-curve type shape there. You can go to the next slide. So after we had all that in place, we started to route all of our traffic through Sodexis, and this is showing the decisions that we're routing to different providers. I believe this is overall just for our users. And you see that as the day progresses, certain providers start to rise and lower depending on demand in particular parts of the world, and given overall performance of any given provider. I think that's it.
Excellent. Thanks, Jared. Now, just to be clear, what everybody's looking at there, each line is a specific CDN that they're routing traffic to, and those are the decisions per day. So the next we'll listen to PBS, a little bit about the challenges they were addressing or facing, and then what they implemented. Mike?
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of PBS Digital. So PBS Digital is responsible for all the digital properties of PBS, the website, video streaming over the web, mobile, OTT. And my operations group is specifically trying to work on keeping track of, my operations group is responsible for making sure everything is running performantly, cost efficiently, and smoothly. Our usage patterns, as you'll see here, tend to be very spiky in the sense that you have a specific pattern. It's cyclical from day to day, time of day to time of day, day of the week to day of the week, month to month. You can see with kids traffic, you can tell exactly when the kids come home from school because you suddenly see traffic start to spike. I could probably tell you what the average bedtime is for most kids around the country because that's when the traffic starts to go down. And the graph you're looking at here is actually the spike that you see in the beginning of the year when Masterpiece Theater comes back on, and we have all the premiere week that happens there. And what we had experienced in the past was that we had a couple of instances where a few years ago there were certain metro areas on certain ISPs with certain CDNs that were just not working well, and so we were getting a lot of calls. We already get emails and calls when people are having problems. Take that times a multiple during the big season of January, February, and it comes across as a black eye to PBS when we can't perform the way we need to. So we decided a couple years ago that we were going to implement a multi-CDN strategy. We'd already been multi-CDN in the sense that we were using one CDN for assets like CSS, JavaScript, that kind of thing, images. And then we were using another CDN for streaming HLS, and then actually another one for using RTMP. And so what we ended up doing was, as we moved away from RTMP to HLS streaming, we went with we talked to Sodexis and set up a multi-CDN strategy for our video. And this last year was the first premiere week that we were actually running multi-CDN, and we had almost zero calls about that as an issue, about video delivery as an issue. There's always other things people call about, they can't get their Apple TV to work or something like that. But with regards to video delivery, we were pretty much had our first clean year ever. And so, yeah, that's PBS.
It's good stuff. You wanted to talk a little bit
Oh, I was
about
gonna-
the...
Yeah. Actually, do you want to talk about this slide?
Sure, I'm happy to.
You're better at describing this
Well,
one.
yes. This is a report that we can run in Sodexis, and what it shows is what we do is we have this concept of micro outages, and a micro outage is merely an availability lapse between a specific ISP and a specific CDN, and it can happen at a very broad level, or it can happen at a very granular, very small level. It can be very geo-focused, a very small ISP, or it can be something broader. What this report shows is that we bucketize the outages. So the big gray bars are outages, and you see 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute. That refers to the duration. So if it went below 80% availability, say for 3 minutes, it would be in that third bucket. So this happened to be during premiere week for, I can't mention the name of the
Masterpiece.
Masterpiece, that's it. I can mention them. But it was a very popular show that PBS broadcast. And what you see is the number of micro outages in each bucket. And then the number on top, the 61,439, are the number of route changes, if you will, things where we routed around that micro outage. So that's essentially where we're providing a better experience versus a worse or no experience to one of the PBS clients. And so this was an actual report from real data for that week during that time. And again, this is what led to the excellent, customer experience that they had for this past premiere week.
And then the last thing I would actually mention is that we're also able to use Sodexis to manage our commits that we have with various CDNs. So we've been able to kind of find a sweet spot with handicapping to be able to say, we know we need to send this much traffic to this CDN and this much traffic to this CDN. Let's find a handicap level that lets us meet those commits, but make sure that nobody's being sent to a CDN that's not going to be performant for them just because we have already paid for that month. So it works pretty well for that.
Excellent. So our last fellow we have on stage here, Zach Schenker of Mubi, and their implementation is quite different. Zach, why don't you give them a flavor for it?
Yeah, so Mubi's a subscription VOD service with the mission to champion great cinema. And we do that through focusing on curation. So every month we have 30 days of film available, and we add one film every day and take one off. So there's always this constant library of ever-changing 30 new films that we have great people, great content team to select and choose these amazing films for you to watch. Over the last year or so, we've migrated from a single CDN solution where we were just doing HLS, had flash players, to a much more modern video stack. We now do smooth streaming, HLS and Dash. We've built out our own private CDN, and overall we've been able to get to a much higher level of quality and QoS and QoE for our customers. As Mike said, our number of support complaints and support issues since we've moved to a stack that we control more, that we have more flexibility with, has been able to overall improve the experience for our consumers, and hopefully through that we've been able to increase the engagement. One of the big drivers behind this as well was lowering the cost of our CDN and general video operations. We've been able to go out there and buy bandwidth, and we buy physical servers, buy bare metal. So far we haven't been buying transit or actually owning infrastructure. So everything that we purchase is on short-term leases. It's month to month, so we can constantly reevaluate all of these deals as we decide that our market changes or our customers change, or we're very flexible to adjust our CDN as our business changes. And this also lets us implement new features within our own stack. So we have our own health check systems that we can use to then feed data into things like Sodexis, and generally know a lot more about the global health of our video delivery. A big part of this as well was with Mubi's model. We have 30 days of film in each country. We are available globally, which means that we have about 600 to 700 films available in our catalog at any point in time. This means that we've got an overall small amount of media, about about 10 terabytes currently, and we can easily replicate all of that media to all of our edge nodes. So unlike any big CDN that you would use, we're effectively achieving a 100% cache hit ratio. And we're able to, in countries where we know we have more traffic, we can store some of the more frequently accessed media on solid state while having some of the media that isn't watched as frequently, or for countries that has fewer subscribers, on slower storage and cheaper storage. So it means that we have a lot more control there, and we can offer a great level of performance to our customers. One of the other big things there is it's allowed us to do on-the-fly repackaging at the edge nodes. So we store the media once, and then using a product from Unified Streaming, we're able to produce HLS, Dash, and smooth streaming on the fly and apply DRM as it's required to our media. So this helps limit the storage requirements that we have and still deliver to a broad range of devices.
Excellent.
Go to the next
Sure.
slide. Yep. So yeah, being a subscription VOD service, we're able to know where our subscribers are, monitor the growth closely, and roll out more infrastructure as it's required. We do have seasonal spikes, certainly around the holiday periods. We usually have a lot more viewers when people are home, but by being able to be over-provisioned always, we're able to quite easily handle these spikes. And overall, we've been able to lower our costs, we've been able to improve performance. Sodexis has been an amazing tool for when we want to evaluate the performance of a new data center or hosting provider that we're working with. We're able to use Radar and deploy to a new testing server, get an idea of performance over time, and then decide whether it's worthwhile to go with that provider. And these month-by-month contracts that we have mean that we can constantly adjust our providers as required.
Great.
Thanks.
Hey, guys, I really appreciate it. So I've got, again, a few simple questions I'm going to ask. We'll go around the horn on those, and then I really hope that you guys have some as well. So one of the first questions a lot of people talk to us about is, well, CDN contracts. What, am I going to spend more money? How does this all work if I'm going to have to go get, just so everyone here knows, Sodexis has no commercial, relationship with the CDNs. We don't resell CDN. So any of our clients have their own commercial relationships. So the question that I had for all these, well, for everybody except maybe Zach, because he does no commercial relationship, was, does going multi-CDN require that you maintain multiple contracts with various providers? And obviously it does. Do you find that difficult? And how has being multi-CDN helped with contract negotiation or harmed it? And finally, in the case of a private CDN, how do you manage your peering and IP transit relationships? Let's start with Jared. Jared, what are your thoughts on managing a multi-CDN, the contracts with the vendors?
Well, there certainly is more overhead, of course. It definitely, the project ended up taking on a bit of a longer duration than we initially anticipated, just at the tail end for the contract negotiations. And some vendors that we wanted to work with, we ended up not being able to due to price matching and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the overhead was worth it, and it does give you a little bit more to play with in terms of pricing and a little bit more leverage there in terms of getting providers to match each other and such, if they're interested in your business and if it's interesting for them as well.
Mike, what were your experiences?
Yeah, pretty much the same. We're in the middle of a couple of longer-term contracts right now, so we really haven't added on any new ones yet. But it definitely means as you add more of these CDNs on, you are dealing with more paperwork and having to make sure you're paying attention to the minutia of, all of the details of each contract, and it definitely makes it more complex.
Sure. And I guess, Zach, in the case of you touched on it in your answer already, but in your case, do you guys have a full-time person who manages primarily your hosting relationships? Because I think you said you don't currently buy transit so much directly.
Yeah, so mostly our VP of engineering has been managing our relationships with different hosting providers. Currently, we're still working with a small number, 1 or 2 hosting providers today, but we are in a lot of negotiations and talking to hosting providers to just see where we can get the best deals. And our software and our stack is certainly built in a way that we can easily migrate and that we can run a very sort of heterogeneous sort of model where we can have servers across multiple hosting providers at the same time.
Excellent. All right, my second question, primarily for PBS and Roblox. This has to do with features. So quite often we come up, and this is both true in the e-commerce space, but also in video, where someone has been using a CDN for a long time, and they're using value-added features of that CDN. And so they find it very difficult, perhaps, to go to a second CDN because they're using features that are really specific. So in the case of e-commerce, there's some very specific features. I won't go into them, but so I'm going to pose that question. Oops, didn't mean to go forward there. Yeah. So in the case, I'll start with Jared again. In the case of Roblox, were you using any specific features of any of the CDNs prior to going to multi-CDN?
Well, we're not using any fancy features. We have really the most base use case you could imagine, which is serving static content. But even just row configuration on what headers are there, other just small pieces, you have to really be detail oriented. We ended up with a very long pre-flight checklist for when we're configuring any new endpoint or bringing on a new provider, just to make sure that everything was consistent and unified. One interesting thing we came across was one provider, a very big provider, had a slight difference in capitalization for a very common header. There's nothing in the spec that said you couldn't have that difference in capitalization, but our client was counting on it being a certain way, and so that was one thing that came up. But there certainly was some overhead in making sure that everything was 100% consistent.
And that's all done more at the configuration layer.
Yep.
Right. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, same thing. We've had to learn the hard way in a couple cases where that we thought there was a new feature we were taking advantage of, and maybe not everybody on the team is fully aware of how we're using Sidexis, and so there might be a case where somebody goes and turns on, they make a change to CORS headers, or they're taking advantage of things like that on one of the CDNs, and we have to make sure we do it in both places. And as the CDNs are starting to iterate and add new features, we're finding that sometimes it doesn't really help us because I can't use edge repackaging or on-the-fly packaging on the edge if only one of my CDNs provides it. So if I'm trying to essentially load balance between these, I have to take the union of the feature set and then also have an understanding of where you change these things in each of them. So yeah, it definitely makes it a lot more complicated.
Does it?
But it's worth it, I think.
And so I'm breaking the cardinal rule of asking a question you don't know the answer to. But did you guys ever use token authentication or DRM with any of your content, or is it all free to air? So you never use any of that?
Right.
So yeah,
No.
I think I remember we talked about that. Okay, and so my last question then is more about regional. So one of the use cases we often see people use Sidexis for is if they're going into China or going into Russia or going into Brazil, any of the classic BRICS countries. And they'll often federate a second CDN or a third CDN that performs better in that region. So I'm going to ask these guys how they deal with regional expansion, and then what those what the problems and solutions are. Again, let's start somewhere different this time. We'll start with Zach this time.
Yeah, so for us, being a global company, being available in 220 countries, it's very important to us to deploy our CDN as widely as we can and to offer services to get as close to as many of our customers as we can. More recently, we've deployed Origins in Brazil when we were starting to notice that we were offering some poor latency and throughput to customers in Central America. And it was through Sidexis, through measurements that we were seeing for customers in those countries that we were able to identify some of these problems. In another case recently, we also noticed that for some German customers on certain ISPs, there were certain times of the day where there were clearly congestion issues from the provider that we were using. So we were able to provision servers with other providers, with direct private peering into some of the ISPs that we were having issues with, and through that significantly improve the performance and experience for a number of those customers.
Excellent. Jared, how about Roblox? I mean, how do you guys manage your business regionally, or is it just global from get-go, or how have you managed, and how often do you review sort of regional performance?
Yeah, we're in constant review, and we're seeing lots of expansion around the globe right now. Our first rough stab at federating across multiple CDN providers was to do it by continent. When we started looking at the data we were collecting via Sodexis and we started drilling in, you start seeing these hotspots, even in these regions that in aggregate perform better on one provider. As you start drilling in, there might be little pockets that are really good on a different provider and the other provider you're looking at are doing terribly. So it was really valuable for us to be able to have this real fine-grained ability to route to the best performing provider.
Excellent. And Mike, I suspect you're not so much broadcasting into other parts of the world, but how do you?
US only.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
How do you look at the performance in the different regions of the U.S.?
We do, but it's largely it's not been really a big problem. There's pretty good coverage with our CDNs in the U.S. and we're U.S. only, so I fortunately don't have to spend much time on that.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so those are the three questions. We want to leave room for you guys to ask questions. So let's start with one, Mark.
It's probably more a curiosity question, but for any content provider, whether you're using 2, 3, 4 CDNs, do the other CDNs have any idea who else you're balancing your traffic over, or is it all anonymous and they just get more or less traffic?
Let me repeat the question, and then we'll pan it up. So the question is, as when you have multiple providers, do the other CDNs know who the other CDNs are?
That a particular content provider is balancing their traffic across.
Right. Any of you guys want to take it? I think the answer is no, not really. I mean, you could find it out.
Yeah.
It's not really difficult to figure out because you just go and look at where things are getting resolved and figure it out. But
To speak to that, I've had
Yeah, please.
providers come to me and say, "Oh, we see you're using so and so and so and
Right.
so and so and so."
Yeah.
But when we were negotiating, we were very open with them around who we were talking to.
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
wondered if they would then try to specifically compete for your business against another particular CDN.
I say if they do, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm very open with the CDNs I work with as to who we're working with and where we're at with various commits and when we can start talking about possibly doing business. And like Pete said, it's a couple of we're using DNS resolution with OpenMix, so a couple of calls to our CNAME, you'll figure out who we're using.
Yeah, and I think it's very much the same with how we work with hosting providers. We're very open with them that we are always talking to other providers and willing to go where we can get the best performance and price.
back in the back.
For delivering to a global audience, is there a certain number of CDNs you recommend?
So the question is, for delivering to a global audience, is there a certain number of CDNs we recommend? Any of you guys have thoughts on that before I launch off into my thoughts on that?
I wouldn't be comfortable giving a specific number. We tested using a bunch of CDNs, and we just picked the ones that we felt gave us coverage where we wanted to have good coverage based on just the performance we saw. I think that's probably a better question for you, Pete.
Yeah, so I think it's a very difficult question. The minimum number, so you're talking about having the best coverage in every part of the world? Yeah, I mean, there's some parts of the world, for instance, that are very dominated by specific CDNs. They just, I'll use China as an example. China has very specific CDNs that do really well in China. And while there are some global CDNs that compete there, they really don't have the best performance there. So, you'd be certain, and even within China, we've got customers that have multiple Chinese CDNs within China because certain networks in China are one CDN works better than the other. So I think the number could get quite large, to be honest. If all you cared about is performance and you didn't care about managing 7 or 8 contracts, it might be in that range. If you cared about consolidating, you could probably get pretty good performance with something like Roblox is doing with 4 CDNs. That's just an opinion, though. There's some science behind it that I'd have to do.
Yeah, and I think currently we're in about 10 different data centers globally, but we're always digging into all of the data that we've collected through Sodexis to sort of understand where would be best to next start placing POPs.
I would think, though, that like you said, that by managing your own servers with a smaller amount of content, you're able to achieve that 100% cache hit ratio by pushing that content out there. I would think that the more CDNs you have, you do probably start to reach a diminishing returns on because you're not going to have stuff fresh in the cache because it's spread out across so many.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, there's some countries where we only have hundreds or a few thousand customers, and in those regions, we're still able to achieve 100% cache hit ratio.
In the far back.
Someone brought up China, and it's got me to thinking about blocking news content or political content. Is there a difference in how CDNs work in a country like China? Like, would one be more likely to get your message out to consumers and not be likely to block versus others?
Well, the short answer is yes. For sure, the native Chinese CDNs are less likely to be blocked. But that being said, I mean, a CDN is a multi-tenant application that if some content, the easiest thing to do to cut off content is to cut off the whole CDN, right? And they have a lot of control in China in particular because of the Great Firewall. So, but yes, the answer is yes, and I'd be hesitant to give you a ton of details in a giant forum like this, but yeah. Any more questions? Yep. Yes, sir.
For Zach, I guess, was there a certain scale where it really made sense to be the private CDN? And I guess, how are you, over time, evaluating ROI versus buying a CDN?
You want me to repeat
Yeah,
it? Yeah, so is there a scale at the point that, what scale issues do you want to get to before you would create a private CDN? Is that a fair, okay. You said it better than me, sorry about that.
Yeah, so for us, I think that very early on, it's as we were migrating away from our prior CDN provider and trying to improve our video experience, it very quickly, our business model was able to sort of drive this decision to go to a private CDN. Even where we have the most customers in the US and UK, but having the global audience, it means that we're able to, even without delivering nearly as much bandwidth as either of these guys, we're still able to significantly lower our cost versus any public CDN that we'd be working with at this point, sort of by an order of magnitude. So really, for us, we've had the engineering team and the operations team to be able to operate and run the CDN, and it's lowered our cost, improved our performance, and been great for our customers. So.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah, there we go.
Just wondering, what's your expectation of this multiple CDN environment? It's almost as though you go to a doctor and he says, well, we don't know, we see this bug that you've got. We're going to give you 5 antibiotics. One of them is going to get to the bug. We're not sure which one. So the question is this an expectation that this is going to go on for a while, or is there going to be some discovery that's going to have these CDNs work? And also, if you're PBS, when you're talking to your CFO and you're saying, well, we have to subscribe to 3 of them, is that cost effective? So, 2-part question. How long has this been going on? Sounds like a song. And then the second is in terms of the ROI on multiple CDN.
So I'll just repeat, it is, how long do we anticipate multi-CDN going on as a strategy? Hopefully a long time. And the second part is what's the ROI, or what would you anticipate that would be moving forward?
Well, I think specifically the question you had about for PBS, it's definitely harder to go to the CFO and explain that we need to engage yet another vendor and in some cases yet another commit, and then I have to monthly deal with questions from our finance team about why didn't we hit the expectation that we thought there was going to be? We predicted out 2 years worth of growth. We're not hitting something exactly, or they don't fully understand the fact that you change the product and put something behind a paywall that wasn't there before. That's going to drop some of the traffic, or if you start using a higher bit rate, that's going to drive more traffic. So yeah, absolutely. It becomes a lot more to manage. It's definitely takes more of my time than if I was just had one CDN that I was working with directly. But on the other hand, I would then be spending all that time with customer support and having to try to dig into problems that I can't solve because, because a certain ISP is not working in a certain area with a certain CDN. So I think that I like the trade-off.
Either way, you
I
guys
share
jump
the
in.
same sentiment. We leverage the strengths of the different networks where they are strong, and we do see our network, aggregate network of content delivery, self-healing when there is a problem. There could be a little micro outage, as mentioned earlier, and we see another provider fairly quickly coming up and picking up the slack when there was an outage there. And we do see overall delivery times reduced. So just in terms of ROI, we have better availability of our content. We do have better pricing in aggregate right now, and we have just better leveraging the strength in the regions for the networks that cater to those regions. So.
And certainly, I think with using Sidexis, it removes a lot of the problem of needing to worry about it. If a node goes down, if there's any outages, it all just automatically gets routed around, and you still deliver a possibly degraded in some cases, but you're always still going to deliver a working experience to your customers.
We got 2 minutes.
For those of you who stream video, have you chosen to emphasize in your rules more throughput or better response time? Which one would you favor?
Let me repeat that. You have a second part to it? Go ahead with your second part then. So the first question is for the streamers, is it more about throughput or more about availability? What in terms of your OpenMix app?
Yeah, I think for us, sort of both throughput and availability are obviously important. More and more customers are becoming very used to very quick start times. You need to hit that play and get it started as quickly as possible. But then there certainly is a desire for getting higher quality and getting up to that highest quality bitrate as quickly as possible. So I think certainly for us, both have been important, and we're always trying to optimize for both. I think in an ABR sort of context, having more throughput hopefully does allow for more segments to be downloaded, and hence you'd have a longer buffer, which can hopefully help with the experience there.
I think we wait towards throughput right now ourselves.
I think we're out of time. I'm so sorry. Hey, can you guys give these guys a hand? But please come up afterwards. Thanks, guys.